You're currently looking at a small patch of farmland, even smaller than a football field, belonging to India, which is completely surrounded by Bangladesh, which is completely surrounded by India, which is completely surrounded by mainland Bangladesh, not to mention these scattered pieces around. And if you want to zoom out on big scale, the India-Bangladesh border looks something like this. An absolute mess due to these enclaves. And if you got no idea what enclaves and exclaves are, let's say these are the countries A and B. And let's say C is a land owned by A but is completely surrounded by B. In this case, C is an exclave of A but is enclave for B. And if there is D completely inside of C, then it will be a second order enclave or a counter enclave. And let's say there is E inside of D, then it will be a third order enclave. The actual thing that made this border so messy was the number of these enclaves. 102 Indian enclaves, inside of which are 21 Bengal counter enclaves, inside of which is one counter enclave, which is that small patch of farmland. And on the Indian side, there were 71 Bengal enclaves containing 7 counter enclaves from India. An absolute mess. But fortunately, this insane border issue was resolved in 2015, and by which the border right now looks like this. Still far away from tidy, but a big relief for the people living in both Bangladeshi and Indian enclaves compared to the previous border that stood for like more than half a century. And keep in mind, both the Indian and Bengal citizens still need a standard visa to cross the borders, unlike the EU. So imagine the absolute hassle the people living in the enclaves had to face. But fortunately, that nonsense has been settled, and that isn't the case anymore. And that was just 2 South Asian nations border, which doesn't exist anymore. But we still got 194 nations left, maybe 95. So of course we do have some really weird borders. Take a look at the US-Canadian border, which looks like this, and they made it look like this. Now they got this Point Roberts, which belongs to the US but is completely cut off. Africa is just full of weird borders thanks to the Europeans. Namibia got this strange arm that extends for like 450 kilometers. Looks like it just want to touch Zimbabwe, but if you zoom in, it's not the case. And right here we've got the Gambia, which just goes along this river and it looks like this. Going up to Europe, this island right here belongs to Spain for 6 months and belongs to France for the other 6 months. And they have been doing it for every year since 1659. That's really weird, but for the next one, we can look at a border that doesn't even divide 2 nations. And for that, we're gonna get to the land down under Australia. Well, you might get really surprised to even hear that there is a border in mainland Australia, but there is one, and for one of the weirdest reasons. This border, built with proper metal fences, is the longest fenced border in the world, with a length of over 5,600 kilometers, which is way longer than even India-Pakistan border or the US-Mexico border. But why does it even exist in Australia, and it doesn't even divide 2 states of Australia or the territories? Well, the thing is, it isn't made for humans. In fact, it's made for dingoes. Well, the Far Cry 3 veterans will surely know what it is, but for those who don't know what dingoes are wild dogs found in Australia. They're kinda like the wolves. So, the longest fenced border in the world for wolves? Well, for the history, when the Englishmen got into Australia, they brought in their cattle as well, in which the main ones were sheep. And after the sheep grew big in number, they became one of the main preys of the dingoes. And it became a big problem for farmers in Australia, as the dingoes would hunt and eat those sheep a lot. So Australians back then decided to build a long fence, a really long fence, to keep out the dingoes on the other side. A fence stretching from Jimbour in Queensland to Nundro in South Australia, making it the longest fenced border in the world. Took them around 8 years to build the fence, and it has worked a lot for the Australian farmers to keep the dingoes out, as the sheep number in Australia skyrocketed after this fence was built. And as of now, the Australian sheep industry is one of the biggest in the entire world, worth almost $7 billion. And that covers for the weird Australian border. Now getting back to those enclave and exclave things. That's how we get weird borders, right? For that, we're heading to the Middle East, where the collision of number of empires have given them some weird borders. Take a look at this piece of land, which belongs to the UAE, which is like twice as big as Monaco, completely surrounded by an exclave of Oman, which is completely surrounded by the UAE, making this piece of land a counter enclave. Obviously, it's not as messy as the India-Bangladesh border, but it's still quite weird if you take a look at how you can access this piece of counter enclave, which is through this road. If you were to travel this road full length, you'd have to start in the UAE, then enter Oman, then enter UAE, then enter Oman, and finally leave Oman for UAE. But fortunately, both the UAE and Omani citizens have the freedom of movement, as both nations are the members of GCC, kinda like the European Union of the Middle East. So this situation isn't that hectic for the people. Oh, and not to mention, this tip of Moshandam Peninsula belongs to Oman as its exclave. And that settles for this border as well. Now we move to Europe, where borders get to another level. As we get to the municipalities of Bal Nassau and Bal Hertog, making border for the Netherlands and Belgium to look like this. In total, there are 22 Belgian enclaves and 8 Dutch enclaves, in which 7 are counter enclaves. And this is what the town of Bal looks like. They've got a population of around 10,000, and border is clearly marked for both the Netherlands and Belgium to let you know where you're in. And it goes through the most ridiculous places. Streets, shops, restaurants or cafes, houses, and even doors. Yeah, living here might seem so stressful, but it's Belgium and Netherlands we're talking about. Both nations are the part of EU Schengen area, so they can move freely around. Both use euro as their currency, and all of them in the town speak Dutch as a main language. So life is quite easy in there for their citizens. But things aren't so easy right down here in northwestern Africa, looking at this border called the Moroccan Berm Wall. Well, Morocco claims all this land, but there exists Western Sahara as well. But Morocco does not recognize Western Sahara having all this land right here. So in 1980, Morocco started building the wall and completed it in 7 years, and now they have this 2,700 kilometers long wall of sand and dirt to keep the rebel groups and common people who want the full sovereignty and land for Western Sahara on this side of the wall, and allow Morocco to occupy this big resource-rich side of the wall, just allowing this tiny piece of coastline for Western Sahara. And of course, it's not easy for you to cross the wall, because there is Moroccan military present right there with their weapons, bunkers, and loads of landmines, making sure they can keep Western Sahara as weak as they can. And this situation has remained for a long time. The Western Saharans have been protesting and fighting to get their sovereignty over their land, but obviously it's so hard against a powerful nation like Morocco. Until this day, more than 80% of Western Sahara is completely occupied by Morocco. And this is why Western Sahara on many maps doesn't look clear at all. And yeah, those were some really strange land borders. But let's have a look at this maritime border as well. You probably do know that the US and Russia share this maritime border lying between these two little islands. These are the Diomedes. The bigger one belongs to Russia and the smaller one belongs to the US. And these islands are just 2.5 miles apart. And not just the maritime border, the international date line passes right between these islands as well. That means the bigger Diomede island is 24 hours ahead of the smaller one, even though they're not even 3 miles apart. And in winter, when the water freezes between these islands, not only it makes an ice bridge allowing you to literally walk from Russia to the US or from the US to Russia, somewhere in there you'd be just one step away from being in a completely different day. That's the closest thing we have for time traveling, I guess. So those were the 6 or 7 borders that I find really insane. And obviously there are a lot more borders that are really weird for some reason. And these are the ones that I find most insane, I guess. Maybe that's gonna be the title of this video. So hope you enjoyed it, and I've got a new update as well. I got my Patreon page where you guys can support me and keep the channel flowing. I just made this page like a few days ago. I surely need to make it look a bit good, so I need some suggestions, and that was it. That's my update. Check it out and I'll see you.